Welcome back to another deep dive. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We're going to be diving into some really cool stuff today.
All stuff.
Um, yeah, it's a chapter of American history that's, well, I think it's pretty fascinating, and I think a lot of people probably don't even know about it.
Yeah, probably not.
It's about the Iroquois Confederacy
Yeah.
and, like, how much they influenced the formation of the United States.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know about that.
Yeah, right. It's kind of mind-blowing when you start to think about it.
It really is.
Kind of challenges some of the stuff you learned in school about, where, like, American democracy comes from and all that.
Yeah, it does.
So we've got two amazing books with us today to help us explore all this.
Too.
Yeah. Forgotten Founders by Bruce C. Johansson.
That book.
Exemplar of Liberty by
Donald A. Grind Jr.
Donald A. Grind Jr.
And Bruce C. Johansson.
And Bruce C. Johansson again.
Yeah, so
we're going to use these books to kind of uncover like the hidden connections between the Iroquois Confederacy and some of the founding fathers.
yeah, some of the big names.
We're talking about Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
People like that. These are guys who their ideas shaped the whole nation, right?
Yeah, the whole foundation.
So we're going to go way back in time before the Revolution to like really understand the Iroquois Confederacy on its own terms.
Before there was even a United States.
Exactly. So what did this pre-Columbian Republic, what did it actually look like? I mean, paint the picture for us.
Okay, so picture North America, right, like way before any Europeans were here. You got the Iroquois Confederacy. It's this union of five nations. Later it became six. But five Native American nations, they were in the northeastern woodlands, and they had this well-established system of governance. And it's crazy. There's no, like, fixed founding date for the Confederacy.
So no one knows exactly when it started?
No one knows. It predates Columbus by centuries.
Centuries.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And what was their system like? Was it anything close to, I mean, was it a democracy?
It had some similarities to democracies. Yeah. The Confederacy had this structure with, like, built-in checks and balances. Each nation had representation in something called the Grand Council.
Oh, the Grand Council.
It was like a central governing body.
Okay.
It was responsible for making decisions that affected the whole Confederacy.
So like a Congress or a parliament, but with different nations instead of states.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And within the Grand Council, there were all these specific roles to help make sure, they made good decisions.
Okay.
Like there were these pine tree chiefs. That's what they were called.
Pine tree chiefs.
Yeah. They were chosen for their wisdom. Like they were the wise ones. And their role was to think about the long-term impact of like every decision they made.
So kind of like a Supreme Court in a way, I guess.
In a way, yeah. They were thinking about the future generations.
Thinking about the future. Wow.
Yeah.
So did they actually vote in this system like we do?
It wasn't exactly like our direct democracy today.
Okay.
But they really valued consensus.
Consensus.
Yeah, like everyone agreeing and public opinion. So leaders weren't chosen through heredity. Like a king, like you inherit the throne.
Okay.
It wasn't like that.
Okay.
It wasn't about force either. They earned authority through their reputation and by getting support from the people.
So you had to earn it, not just inherit it.
Yeah, it was about respect. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Women. They played a huge role in Iroquois society.
Oh, wow.
And in governance. They had titles, influenced decisions, and even helped select leaders.
Seriously.
Yeah, they had clan mothers, for example. They had real power within their clans, and their opinions mattered a lot in the Grand Council.
That's pretty progressive, especially for a society that was around, like, way before modern democracies.
Right, way before. And, when the Europeans started coming over and seeing all this, they were fascinated.
Yeah, I bet.
It was a mix of fascination and, some prejudice, too. But even the Europeans who saw indigenous people as savages, they couldn't deny that the Iroquois Confederacy, it was sophisticated.
It was a wake-up call.
It was like, hey, maybe our way isn't the only way.
Right. So, like, these early encounters were really changing how Europeans thought about indigenous societies.
They were, yeah. And you can see this shift in the writings of a guy named Cadwallader Colden. He was a big deal in colonial New York back then.
Okay, Cadwallader Colden.
Yeah. He actually compared the Iroquois Confederacy to the Roman Republic?
The Roman Republic.
Yeah, which was like the gold standard for a republican government in Europe at the time. Can you believe that?
I mean, that's a huge statement for a European to make, especially back then.
It is.
So the Iroquois were really making people rethink everything they thought they knew about, like governance and how societies should work.
They really were. That's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. It forces us to look beyond the usual, Eurocentric view of history and recognize, like, hey, indigenous people had a lot to contribute to ideas that we usually think of as, like, just Western ideas.
It's not just about, like, rewriting history. It's about acknowledging everyone who contributed to the ideas that we kind of take for granted today.
Exactly. And seeing how those ideas shaped things. So you've probably heard of the Great Law of Peace, right?
Yeah, the Great Law of Peace. What is that exactly?
It's essentially the Iroquois Constitution.
Their constitution?
Yeah. It's oral tradition, though, passed down through generations.
Okay.
It lays out the principles of the Confederacy, how the Grand Council works, the leaders' roles, the values, everything.
Wow.
It even talks about impeachment, making sure leaders are accountable to the people.
No way, like checks and balances, just like we have.
Yeah. Think of it as a framework for peace, for unity, for just and fair governance.
Amazing. An oral constitution that's older than the United States Constitution.
It's mind-blowing, right? And it's not just about structure. The Great Law of Peace, it reflects their values, too.
Their values.
Yeah, things like consensus, individual liberty, the well-being of future generations. It's a remarkable document. Really shows how sophisticated they were, politically and philosophically.
I can totally see how these ideas might have resonated with someone like Benjamin Franklin, right? He was always interested in different ways of governing.
Oh, yeah. Franklin was fascinated by the Iroquois.
He was.
He went to their treaty councils, he talked with their leaders, he even used examples from the Iroquois in his own writing.
Really? So he was actually using them as inspiration for his own ideas about government and society.
He was. It's really something to think about.
Okay, let's talk about Franklin. What are some specific connections between his thinking and the Iroquois Confederacy? Give it the details.
All right, let's dive into that. So one of the most striking examples is Franklin's Albany Plan of Union.
Oh, yeah, the Albany Plan.
It was this plan for a unified colonial government.
Right, the colonies needed to be more unified.
Exactly. That was like their big problem. They weren't unified enough, and they desperately needed to be, especially with all those tensions with France, right?
Yeah, they had to, like, present a united front.
Right. And get this, Franklin's plan, with all the stuff about representation from different colonies, a central council, checks and balances.
Okay.
It all looks really similar to the Iroquois Confederacy.
So you're saying Franklin, like one of the founding fathers of the U.S., maybe got his ideas from the Iroquois?
It's a real possibility. There's no, smoking gun, no one saying, hey, I got this from the Iroquois, but come on, look at the parallels. Franklin was totally fascinated by the Iroquois, and the Albany Plan looks a lot like their government. It makes you think.
That's wild. It really changes how you think about American democracy.
It does. And it's not just the structure of the government either.
But there's more.
Yeah, Franklin saw a lot of these big Enlightenment ideas in action with the Iroquois.
Give me an example.
Religious tolerance.
Religious tolerance.
The Iroquois Confederacy, right? It had all these different nations, each with their own beliefs, but they all lived together peacefully.
Right.
And that really spoke to Franklin. He was big on religious freedom.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, back then, religion was a huge deal, and the colonies, all these different groups competing.
Right. And Franklin also saw, with the Iroquois, how important public opinion was.
Public opinion.
Yeah, and the role of property in society. Stuff that he later wrote about, which then became, central to American thought. You know what I mean?
It's like he was seeing these big abstract ideas, like the stuff the Enlightenment guys were talking about, but he's seeing them in real life with the Iroquois. Like, hey, this stuff actually works.
Yeah, exactly. And it wasn't just Franklin. Thomas Jefferson, another founding father, he also thought the Iroquois government was amazing.
Really? Jefferson, too.
Oh, yeah. Jefferson was all about consensus.
Consensus?
Yeah, government getting its power from the people, the consent of the governed. He saw that with the Iroquois, their leaders earned respect from the people, not just by force or inheriting power.
That's totally Jeffersonian. Right. Individual liberty, limited government, all that.
Spot on. Jefferson actually praised the Iroquois, for this whole system of popular consent, limiting government, listening to the people. He even used examples from them in his own writing.
Crazy. So both of these major figures, Franklin and Jefferson, they were taking inspiration from the Iroquois, not just admiring them from afar. They were actually using their ideas.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And it gets even more obvious during the revolution itself.
Okay, now we're getting to the revolution. So how did the Iroquois influence play out during the revolution? Was it just symbolic, or did it actually, like, affect things?
It was both. Think about the Boston Tea Party.
Boston Tea Party.
Remember those guys? The Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Mohawks.
Yeah, classic image. I never really thought about why they dressed up like that, though.
It wasn't just a costume, man. They were trying to connect their cause, the revolution, with this idea of the Iroquois resisting tyranny.
Okay.
To the colonists, the Iroquois represented that fight against oppression, that struggle for self-government.
So they're basically using the Iroquois as a symbol for freedom, for rebellion.
Exactly. And it resonated with people. It tapped into this whole narrative of indigenous resistance that had been building for, like, forever.
Right, right.
And it wasn't just symbols either.
What do you mean?
The colonists actually fought, like, the Iroquois during the war. Think about it. They're up against this huge, powerful British army, trained for European-style battles.
Yeah, redcoats.
Exactly. So who did they turn to for inspiration? The Iroquois. They learned about guerrilla warfare, how to fight in the forests, how to be unpredictable.
It must have freaked the British out, right? Like they're expecting these big formal battles, and then suddenly they're getting ambushed in the woods.
Totally. It messed up their plans, disrupted their supplies, and it made them rethink everything about how they were fighting the war.
So these tactics, learned from the Iroquois, were actually a big part of how the colonists won.
Absolutely. It's a game changer.
It's amazing to see how this all connects, right? We've gone from pre-Columbian times, with their councils and pine tree chiefs, to the Revolution, with guys dressed as Mohawks and guerrilla tactics in the woods. The Iroquois influence, it wasn't just some passing fad, it had a real lasting impact on the new nation.
It's woven right into the U.S. Its structure, its principles, everything.
Give me an example, like specifically how?
Okay, so what's federalism? Power shared between a central government and individual states.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. The Iroquois.
Bingo. The Grand Council and the individual nations balancing power.
It's like a mirror image.
It really is. And it's not just the structure either, it's the values, man. All this talk about unity, consensus, compromise in American politics, that's straight out of the Iroquois playbook. Remember, they made decisions through deliberation. Everyone had a say.
So the Iroquois basically gave us a model, a blueprint for how all these different groups, these colonies, could come together, keep their own identities, but work as one.
Exactly. And you know what? That model, it's still relevant today. We're still struggling with diversity, representation, how to govern this big, complex society.
It's kind of inspiring to think about,
Agree, yes.
the Iroquois Confederacy inspiring founding fathers and still inspiring us today to build a better, fairer world.
It is. It's a powerful story.
Yeah.
But there's also a tragic side to it, What happened to the Iroquois after the Revolution? It's not exactly a happy ending.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. All this talk about liberty and happiness, it didn't really apply to Native Americans, did it?
Sadly, no. The Iroquois, like all indigenous nations, they got caught in the gears of westward expansion. They were pressured to give up their land, to assimilate.
It's like the nation they helped create turned against them.
It's a terrible irony, for sure. The Iroquois Confederacy, which survived for centuries, dealing with all those colonial powers, now they had this new, even more powerful enemy, the United States.
What happened to them? How did they react? Did they just, give up?
Oh, they fought back. They were resilient. They kept asserting their sovereignty. They negotiated treaties. They resisted, some diplomatically, some through fighting. But it was a tough fight.
Yeah, I bet.
They were up against this massive force, this growing nation with its army, its belief in manifest destiny, this idea that westward expansion was inevitable.
Well, nothing could stop it.
Right. And all this pressure, it started to cause divisions within the Iroquois Confederacy. Some nations, like the Oneidas, they sided with the colonists during the Revolution, hoping to build a new relationship based on mutual respect,
Sounds like a good strategy.
You'd think so, right?
But I bet it didn't really work out that way.
It didn't. Even though they were allies, the Oneidas still had to give up land, and they were treated, well, like a conquered people.
What about the other Iroquois nations? What did they do?
It was all over the place, The situation was super complex. Some, like the Senecas, tried to stay neutral, hoping to just keep their land and their autonomy.
Okay.
Others, like the Mohawks, they actually allied with the British, hoping to use them as a shield against the Americans.
So this once powerful unified confederacy was now falling apart, pressured by this new nation that saw their land as, free for the taking. What happened then? Did they just get crushed?
They faced huge, huge challenges, no doubt. But they were incredibly resilient. They kept asserting their sovereignty, they kept negotiating treaties, and they kept resisting in every way they could against this relentless push westward.
Man, these stories are really important, you know. It makes you question this whole idea of American exceptionalism, this narrative that we've been told. It forces us to look at the darker side of things, how the nation was built.
Yeah, it does. It's complicated. And there's this one figure who really embodies all this complexity, this Seneca leader named Corn Planter. He's a key player in this post-revolutionary period.
Corn planter. Yeah, I've heard of him.
Ah.
What's his deal?
Well, at first, he was a warrior, leading Seneca war parties against settlers. But he was also smart. He saw how the power was shifting. He knew diplomacy was important too. He saw all the destruction from war. He wanted to find a way for his people to survive in this new world.
So he was like a pragmatist,
Right.
trying to find the best solution, even if it wasn't perfect.
Yeah, exactly. He knew there weren't any easy answers. So Corn Planter, he starts negotiating with the U.S. government. He signs treaties that, in his mind, offered the best chance for peace, for keeping some of the Seneca land.
But I bet those treaties weren't exactly fair.
No, they weren't. He had to make concessions, a lot of them. And a lot of Senecas were angry about it. They felt betrayed. They called Corn Planter a sellout, said he was giving away their land and their sovereignty for peace.
Man, that's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah.
Trying to lead your people, knowing any decision you make is going to upset somebody.
It was, yeah. It shows the impossible choices that Native American leaders faced back then. They're dealing with this powerful, often ruthless government, knowing that any agreement means giving up something precious.
It reminds you that history isn't simple, right? It's not just good guys and bad guys. It's about real people making tough calls, sometimes with tragic results.
It's all about nuance. And Corn Planter's story, even though it's messy and controversial, it helps us understand all that nuance. It's essential.
So where are we now? We've seen how the Iroquois Confederacy, with its whole system of government, all about unity and consensus, it influenced guys like Franklin and Jefferson, even shaped the structure of the U.S. itself. But then we see this tragic irony, the U.S. turning on the Iroquois, pushing them to the brink, taking away their sovereignty.
It's a mixed legacy for sure. They contributed so much to the nation's founding, but their people suffered from that nation's growth.
It's like this double-sided story, you know? Inspiration on one side, oppression on the other. And it makes you think, what can we learn from all this today? How can we honor what the Iroquois did, but also acknowledge the wrongs they faced?
Those are the right questions to ask. We need to think about them deeply, and we need to go beyond just recognizing them, not just seeing the Iroquois as a footnote in history. We need to see them as active participants, shaping American thought, challenging the story we've been told about the nation's founding.
And it's not just about acknowledging it, it's about action, right? Like understanding how what happened back then still affects indigenous communities today and actually doing something about it.
100%. It's about learning from the past, not just remembering it. And that means listening to indigenous communities today, supporting their sovereignty, working for a future where they have a voice, where their rights are respected.
It's realizing that the Iroquois story, even with all the tough chapters, it's still being written. And we're all part of that story now.
We are. But let's go back to how they influenced American thought. You said earlier that their ideas kept spreading even after the revolution.
Right. Tell me more about that.
Okay, so think about westward expansion, right? That's like the biggest thing in American history. It wasn't just about grabbing land, conquering stuff. It was about ideas, too. About how this new nation saw itself, its identity, its destiny. And the Iroquois, even though they were being pushed aside, they still shaped that vision.
Wait, so even as they were being marginalized, the Iroquois were still influencing how Americans saw themselves? How is that even possible?
It's about symbols, about narratives. Think about the frontier, right? That wild, untamed land full of danger and opportunity. That image became central to how Americans saw themselves, this whole idea of self-reliance, pushing westward progress.
Yeah, Manifest Destiny. Like, it was America's fate to take over the continent, bring civilization, all that.
Exactly. And that story, that narrative, it's tied to the Iroquois, even if we don't realize it. Remember, they lived in that wilderness, they mastered it, they built a whole society there.
So the frontier, this symbol of America, it's partly a reflection of the Iroquois themselves. It's like their image was haunting the American imagination, even as they were being pushed out.
That's a great way to put it. It's really complicated and fascinating. And it's not just the frontier either. The Iroquois influenced a lot of other stuff in American history. You wouldn't even believe it.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more. What else did they influence?
Think about the 19th century. All those social movements, abolition, women's suffrage, even those utopian communities, everybody trying to change things.
Yeah, all the reformers, the radicals, shaking things up. What do they have to do with the Iroquois?
Well, think about those core Iroquois principles we talked about. Consensus, individual liberty, public opinion, women's roles in society.
Yeah, pretty radical stuff, especially back then.
Totally. And those ideas, they resonated with those 19th century movements. They show up in the writings of abolitionists who were fighting for equality. They're there with the suffragists demanding a voice in politics, challenging traditional roles for women, and even in those utopian communities, trying to build new societies based on cooperation and communal living. It's all connected.
So these movements, even though they weren't directly linked to the Iroquois, they were still drawing on some of the same ideas, those ideals about freedom, equality, the people having power.
Exactly. That's what's so cool about studying the Iroquois influence. It's not always about direct connections. It's about these underlying principles, these ideas that keep moving through time, influencing movements, shaping how people see things, challenging the way things are in all these surprising ways.
Like throwing a stone in a pond,
Yeah.
and the ripples just keep spreading outward.
Perfect analogy. And those ripples of Iroquois influence, you can follow them right into the 20th century with the civil rights movement, environmental justice, all of that.
So this isn't just ancient history. It's alive. It's still affecting us today.
It really is. It's a legacy that deserves to be explored, understood, and respected.
It's amazing, right? These ideas, starting out in the forests and longhouses, and they've had this impact for centuries on all these social movements.
It shows you that some values, they're just universal, you know? These
Yeah.
ideas, they cross cultural boundaries, they have real power.
Let's dig into those 20th century movements you mentioned, like the civil rights movement. What was the Iroquois connection there?
Okay, think about the heart of the civil rights movement. What were they fighting for?
Racial equality, voting rights, ending segregation.
Right, it was about justice, about America actually living up to its ideals.
Exactly.
And those demands, they line up perfectly with what the Iroquois believed. Consensus, everyone being included, working for the common good. Their system was designed to make sure everyone had a say, that decisions were good for the whole community.
Like a model for fairness for everyone participating, no matter your race.
That's it. And you see the same thing with the environmental movement.
Oh, yeah, the environment.
The Iroquois, they had this deep respect for nature. They understood how everything's connected. It's like the opposite of that, exploitative mindset that's messed up the environment.
Like they were way ahead of their time thinking about sustainability, living in harmony with nature.
They understood balance, ecological balance.
Right.
They saw themselves as part of nature, not separate from it.
And they lived that way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is something we really need to pay attention to now with climate change, all the environmental problems.
Yeah, big time.
The Iroquois remind us we're not just in charge of the earth, we're part of this web of life, and what we do affects everything.
We need to think more holistically, find a sustainable way to live.
100%. And this is also super relevant to indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, all that.
Right.
The Iroquois Confederacy, they governed themselves for centuries. It's a powerful example of indigenous people's right to control their own destinies, their own lives.
It's like this reminder shining through history that indigenous peoples have always had their own systems, their own laws, their own ways of doing things.
And those systems, even after colonization, oppression, they're still here. They teach us about resilience, about holding on to your culture, about different ways of life coexisting.
So it's not just the Iroquois story, it's everyone's story, in a way.
It is. So as we finish up this deep dive, I'm just in awe, The Iroquois Confederacy, how complex it was, how sophisticated, how their ideas shaped America, even while they were struggling.
It's mind-blowing.
And how they still inspire people fighting for justice, equality, a better world.
It really makes you think.
It does. History is not just dates and battles. It's about ideas, values, and people never giving up.
Right, the human spirit.
And the Iroquois story, it's woven into America. It shows us that truth, that those things matter.
It challenges us to think differently, to see the bigger picture, to recognize everyone who contributed, even those who were pushed aside, forgotten.
Exactly. And it makes us think about our own values, what we believe in, how we can build a future where everyone's treated fairly, with respect.
Okay, Deep Divers, that's our exploration of the Iroquois Confederacy for today.
Hope you learned something new.
We went back in time, made some connections, maybe busted some myths you learned in school.
Busted some myths.
I hope you see the Iroquois legacy differently now, how much they impacted America.
They really did.
Until next time. Keep diving deep.